So, since the publication of the first volume of Technics and Time 20 years ago, Stiegler has shown us, and I think continues to show us, perhaps more than any other thinker, the extent to which the technique of thought is not just a question of style, rhetoric, or the form of philosophical thinking, but rather can refer to the way we can conceive the fundamental technicity of thought itself, and the way in which technical traces form the milieu that constitutes thought as such. So this rubric, for me, the technique of thought, points us first and foremost to the understanding of thought itself as technical through and through. The phrase in French, la technique de la pensée, can therefore refer both to the technique of thought understood as its methods, protocols, or procedures, and to its fundamental technicity. It affirms the thoroughgoing materiality of thought, of consciousness, of reason, and all noetic activity of any kind. And this, I would argue, necessarily implies a commitment to a certain kind of naturalism, whereby naturalism is understood in the broadest terms as the thinking of all existence and all thought as being in a continuity with the material and biological world, and as a thinking which excludes all modes of transcendence above and beyond that natural world, all modes of ideal or suprasensible reality. And yet, and this is the key to my argument here, Stiegler's naturalism, if it can be called that, is very different, of course, from anything like its Anglo-American forms. The naturalism of figures such as Quine and Sellers, and more broadly speaking, what one might call methodological naturalism, articulate a very specific relation between science and philosophy, and affirm a very specific image of the world, a very specific scientific image of the world. So, in Quine, for instance, it is the epistemological sufficiency of science that limits, but at the same time grounds, philosophical knowledge, and which therefore in turn grounds and founds our knowledge of reality in general. More broadly, methodological naturalism establishes a close alignment of science and philosophy. Their goals would be the same, as would be the general techniques they deploy to produce knowledge of the world. Stiegler's discourse, we will see, in its synthesis of phenomenological and post-phenomenological thinking with, amongst others, psychosocial, anthropological, biological, and neuroscientific frameworks, implies a very different relation between science and philosophy, one which is in no way reducible to a relation of shared goals and method, nor to one of limitation and foundation, which would give science a certain epistemological privilege. Nor, I will argue, is Stiegler's discourse easily assimilable to diverse strands of naturalism within the European or so-called continental tradition. This is where perhaps it's a bit more contentious, but for instance, the phenomenological naturalism of Merleau-Ponty, or, I would add, the critical Nietzschean Spinozist naturalism of Deleuze. The stakes of the relation of philosophy to science in the project of general organology are more than purely theoretical. For if, from the trilogy of Technics and Time onwards, Stiegler's thought has constituted itself as a critique of hyperindustrialization and of the symbolic misery of contemporary capitalism, and has sought to be a call to arms and to provide conceptual weapons to make, I quote, an arsenal of concepts with a view to pursuing a struggle, then it has done so within a very specific field of struggle and a very specific configuration of contemporary capitalism. Put schematically, the convergence of technoculture and of capitalist production and consumption with industrial modes of ordering psychical and collective individuation. Now, part of this wider configuration and dynamic of convergence is, I would add and argue, the specific relation between philosophy and science implied by a dominant schema of scientism within the contemporary culture of hyperindustrial capitalism, and particularly within the mediatisation of science and scientific research in the UK and elsewhere. If we take scientism to be the belief that the methods and findings of the physical and biological sciences will give the answers to all meaningful questions that can be raised in any and every domain or discipline, and in particular to all the most fundamental issues concerning the human, then a convergence of disciplines can broadly be discerned within what I would be inclined to call the matrix of official knowledge, which aligns itself with contemporary economic and political orthodoxies. Such a matrix might be said to constitute itself in a more or less ideological alignment of fields such as, amongst others, evolutionary psychology, neo-Darwinist biology, the highly mathematized forms of contemporary economics, theory of the mind and computational theory of the mind approaches, particularly when aligned with techniques of neuroscience such as magnetic resonance imaging. It would be within this scientist matrix that the fundamental understanding of the human that underpins neoliberal political and economic forms is arguably perpetuated and maintained in a dominant mode within the official knowledge culture of contemporary capitalism. The proximity of scientism as a belief form with the methodological naturalism of the Anglo-American tradition alluded to above should probably be clear. In each case, it's the authority of science which is called upon to ground human knowledge and knowledge of the human. Yet if general organology is to enact itself as an effective struggle within this wider field of capitalist culture, then it also has to confront or combat this pervasive scientism, not least because scientism itself proposes a hegemonic orthodoxy in relation to the human, technology and science, which is entirely at odds with Stiegler's organological vision. And of course it is precisely the privileging of scientific epistemology within scientism which would allow it to dismiss the general philosophical approach of general organology and its specific synthesis of post-phenomenological, psychosocial and scientific discourses. Now, it's not at all a question here of attacking or denigrating the validity of scientific knowledge or its methods. Rather, it may be a question of critically interrogating and indeed limiting the more general philosophical and metaphysical claims underpinning scientism through a reorientation of the relation of science to philosophy, and specifically a reconfiguration of this relation within a new kind of naturalism that challenges the privileged place given to science within Anglo-American naturalism and within so much of the broader Anglophone analytic tradition. It was Bertrand Russell who wrote in The Problems of Philosophy that, I quote, "Philosophical knowledge does not differ essentially from scientific knowledge, and that there is no special source of wisdom open to philosophy but not to science, and the results obtained by philosophy are not radically different from those obtained by science." Now, it's precisely this alignment of philosophy with science that I think needs to be challenged within a broader struggle against contemporary scientism. Of course, the tradition of European, or what we sometimes call continental philosophy in the 20th century, has by and large always diverged from or challenged this specific alignment of philosophy and science, so embedded in the Anglophone analytic tradition. But as contemporary French and other European philosophers building upon this continental tradition turn towards science and towards the life sciences in particular, but also to mathematics and to an embrace of naturalism more generally, the nature of this alignment must be cast in entirely new terms. In Stiegler's most recent major work, States of Shock, État de choc, what we find is, and I've talked about this in his earlier work as well elsewhere, a transformative combination of discourses, one which integrates his earlier phenomenological and post-phenomenological bioanthropological combinations of techniques and time with, amongst other things, a much more highly developed Simondonian framework and now a much less marginal or secondary reference to the brain, to cerebral plasticity and to the nervous system. Now, it's within this novel integration or synthesis of a post-phenomenological thought of technical retention, a Simondonian thought of psychosocial individuation, and biological and neuroscientific frames that a new and distinctive relation of philosophy to science can be discerned. I'm going to outline the basic structure now of the transductive relation, and I know we've talked about this in the conference already, not least Bernard has pointed to this structure and others have, but you'll forgive me for reiterating something quite basic. It's important for my argument. So état de choc, states of shock, is articulated around a specific integration of the discourse of neurobiology and of cerebral plasticity with the post-phenomenological language of Husserlian tertiary retention or of technical retraces, a post-Freudian or post-Nietzschean reference to libidinal economy, and the Simondonian thinking of a pre-individual psychosocial field of psychic and collective individuation, amongst other things perhaps. The language Stiegler uses to articulate the relation of the neurobiological, the post-phenomenological, the libidinal, and the psychosocial is one of a layering of these different elements, and of the conditioning, constitution, formation, or construction of the psychic apparatus on the basis of this layering. Specifically, Stiegler calls upon the language of base, or fond in French, as in the following. Technical traces are the milieu of that cerebral plasticity on the basis of which the psychic apparatus is formed, or what Simondon called the psychic individual. Second quote, from out of the psychosocial pre-individual funds, psychic individuation and collective individuation are simultaneously arranged according to Simondon, and where all this presupposes, as I can feel compelled to add at this point, technical individuation. Just to comment on the translation of fond there as funds. Fond does clearly translate as funds, but to me there's also important background there in sort of Gestalt thinking of the relation of figure to ground, figure et fond, the figure being something that is cut out against the background or emerges from the background of a ground. So I would prefer there the translation of ground for fond, which is what I'll be using. So, the brain and nervous system are a neurobiological base upon which the psyche is formed and in relation to the technical milieu. At the same time, the layer of the psychosocial would seem to be situated somewhere between that neurological base and the psyche and articulated within the milieu of technical traces, itself taken as a ground of individuation, forming or constituting and conditioning in a dynamic becoming all of the system. Elsewhere, Stiegler speaks of the Bildung, or formation of reason, and of individual and collective memory, conditioned by technical retentions, or by the plane or field of technical hypomnesic supports. And elsewhere again, he speaks of mental images as being constituted on a specific biological base, or vital modality, which would prefigure forms of sensory and motor perception. In all these examples, the reference appears to be to a layered model articulated as a biological base, a psychosocial and technical pre-individual field or plane, and the formation or constitution of individual and collective psyche, reason and memory out of these preceding layers. Now, this layered model might initially, and obviously wrongly, suggest some kind of reductionism, whereby the neurological base determines psychic individuation and noetic activity in general, in such a way that these can always be causally reduced or related back to that base. Yet Stiegler takes great care, evidently, to argue that these layers form a dynamic system of interaction based on the transductive relation. Here, the plasticity of the brain, its ability to make new synaptic connections and pathways throughout life, and mould or remould itself based on interaction with the external world, means that the neurobiological layer is never a static or purely causal base. Speaking in a footnote in État de choc of the becoming of the technical layer of tertiary retentions, Stiegler underlines that cerebral plasticity forms a system with this becoming, as modification of the vital layer that, transformed by the technical layer, becomes the psychic layer in Simondon's sense. Here, the technical plasticity of clay for the one who shapes it, and who at the same time shapes themselves by producing knowledge, is not just a metaphor for neuronal plasticity, but its condition. This dynamic interaction between layers is no unidirectional causal determination of a superstructure by its base, but rather an interaction where both the psyche and its neurobiological foundation are very readily fluid, mouldable, or transformable, and where the becoming of the inorganic technical field, although itself transformable as a becoming, represents a more solid layer, a layer that is more fixed or set, but which is nevertheless susceptible to being worked upon. So cerebral plasticity is conditioned or constituted as such by the relative solidity of the technical layer or milieu. As Stiegler puts it, this plasticity is possible only on the condition of passing through its sterilizing exteriorization. That is, its solidifying and fixing exteriorization. This pharmacology of the fluid and the solid is also what conditions the plasticity of the noetic brain. So both the neurologically plastic brain, which is the object of empirical neuroscientific study, and the noetic brain, the brain that thinks, reasons, and is experienced only in and as our experience of the world and of the consciousness of a world, both these layers, the biological and the psychic, are plastic, mouldable, or transformable based on this dynamic interaction with the relative solidity of the inorganic technical layer, plane, or field. Our exposure to, apprenticeship with, and interiorization of the technical field conditions the formation and stabilization of neural networks, of synaptic connections, pathways, and systems, which in turn lays the base for a formation of the psychic individuation out of that technical field. Yet this also means that the noetic activity of the brain, of the psychical apparatus and individuated psyche, can in turn take the technical field as the object of its activity and work to transform and influence its becoming. So there would be some level of psychic autonomy and agency opened up here, whereby the fluid or plastic psyche can turn back and work transformatively on the relatively set or solid technical field. And we go back to some of the issues raised in Martin's paper at the beginning of the conference. Now this, it seems to me, is the essence of Stiegler's pharmacological thinking of the plastic and fluid in État de choc, and the condition of his call to responsibility and action in relation to the contemporary milieu of industrialized techniques. There are really no grounds, therefore, to accuse Stiegler of biological reductionism or technological determinism in this complex dynamic of neurobiological, technical, and psychosocial formation. However, given the separation of each of these moments out into layers or distinct fields or planes that transductively relate each with the other, there is every reason, I think, to question the exact status of each and what this might imply for the nature of their interaction, their continuity with one another, and for Stiegler's overall attempt to synthesize them within a general organology. So, the neurological layer or base would first and foremost be empirical, and the empirical object of scientific research and knowledge. Here the brain and the nervous system appear as objects of knowledge within an already constituted world to be investigated via electroencephalograms, magnetic resonance imaging, and other forms of neurological scanning or experimental activity. The milieu of technical traces and retentions, the pre-individual psychosocial ground, the fond of the psyche, cannot, insofar as they precede psychic individuation as its constitutive condition, be aligned with the empirical appearance of technical objects as such, however much these objects necessarily remain the effective means or support of retentional traces and of psychosocial conditioning. Rather, the plane of the trace, of retention, and of the psychosocial ground must be in a certain Derridian sense quasi-transcendental, or more precisely, as Stiegler himself articulates it in States of Shock, État de choc, it must be meta-empirical. That is to say, the condition of experience that is not experienced as such by experience, which constitutes the possibility of experience, but that is still not transcendental because it itself has its provenance in experience. So the plane of technical retentions is very much immanent to experience insofar as empirical technical objects are the bearers of such retentions, but in the same way also anterior to conscious experience insofar as it conditions psychic individuation and makes something like thought and consciousness possible in the first instance. Though there is a sense here already that this plane is irreducible to the empirical field and the kind of objectivist ontology proper to neurobiological and neuroscientific knowledge or research. Similarly, the layer of the psychically individuated self, of thought, of consciousness, or noetic activity is also nothing objectifiable or reducible to the status of an empirical object. The psychical apparatus is, as Freud would tell us, a system distinct from the neurological base of the brain or the nervous system. Phenomenological thinking, on the other hand, would tell us that intentional consciousness is entirely irreducible to straightforwardly observable or empirically verifiable brain activity. One need only think of Husserl's rejection of psychologism from his early work in the logical investigations onwards, Heidegger's understanding of Dasein and of ontological difference, or of Merleau-Ponty's consistent and career-long anti-psychologism, to understand just how far the phenomenological perspective, and I might say post-phenomenological perspective, insists that our intentional consciousness or transcendence towards a world and an experience of being cannot be reduced to anything like a being or a thing, and therefore to any empiricist, objectivist, or positivist ontology. So it's clear that Stiegler's layers each have a very different status: empirical, meta-empirical, and psychic, or one might still say phenomenological. The question arises here as to how, in their distinctness from each other, and in the irreducibility of the phenomenological, the psychic, and the meta-empirical to the empirical, they nevertheless exist in a continuity with each other in such a way they can interact in a complex dynamic, or the transductive relation Stiegler describes. Clearly, his transformative combination of different contexts means that the references to phenomenology in Stiegler's work from Technics and Time on imply a modified or radically changed post-phenomenological perspective. Yet when he talks of the noetic brain on the one hand, and of cerebral plasticity, synapses, and the nervous system on the other, I think he is nevertheless marshalling two levels which appear to be radically discontinuous rather than being in a continuity with one another. It was Merleau-Ponty who, in Phenomenology of Perception, remarked that the human body is not simply an object in the world, but a very means of access to the world, or the site of the opening of the world. The same could be said, I think, of the noetic brain. On the one hand, it cannot be assimilated to the status of technical objects, which are both empirical things and the bearer of meta-empirical retentions or traces. On the other, the brain is at once both an empirical object known to neuroscience, but at the same time, the ontological site from which a world is opened as such, and from which consciousness and psychical or noetic life emerge. Yet the empirical and neuroscientific study of the brain as object can know nothing of its lived phenomenological experience, except perhaps by inferring correlations with reported noetic activity or experience. This is my interest in the voodoo correlation debate that Cornelius raised the other day. And similarly, intentional consciousness and psychic or noetic activity can know nothing of the immanent materiality of its own neurological cerebral base. It can only approach the brains of others, if you like, as objects constituted within its empirical field, or as Cornelius suggested, perhaps researchers can view their own brains doing something, but then it's as an object. It's not a known knowledge of their immanent brain, if you like. So between the neurobiological plastic brain, empirically known, and the noetic, psychically and phenomenologically or ontologically disclosive brain, a gap or void appears to open up. The two are in some kind of continuity with each other, they interact and form a system with technics, but they are also irreducible to each other. One could appear to Merleau-Ponty here and is thinking in the structure of behaviour of a third dialectic that governs the relation of the biological world of culture and signification in terms of a gap or a delay, Or one could appeal to Merleau-Ponty's later thinking of intertwining in chiasmus and his ontology of the flesh to somehow think this simultaneous continuity and discontinuity between the neurobiological and the noetic brain. Almost obviously, one could appeal to Deleuze's naturalism, his ontological monism, which would situate the neurobiological and the noetic on a single plane of immanence. Well, Merleau-Ponty's complex and somewhat indirect relation to Simondon and the Deleuzian appropriation of Simondon might give us every reason for pursuing one or other of these paths. Yet Stiegler's radical modification of phenomenology via the inscription of techniques at a fundamental level make his thinking, I think, incompatible with Merleau-Ponty's philosophy and the Merleau-Pontian thinking of the intertwining and chiasmus of flesh in particular. At the same time, this may be contentious, his use of a post-phenomenological framework of tertiary retention, of consciousness, and the separation of the neurobiological and the noetic, this gap or void that I've been pointing to, seems to me to be incompatible with the Deleuzian plane of immanence. The simultaneous continuity and discontinuity of the neurobiological and the noetic brain can best be understood, I think, in terms of an experience of and a passage to the limits of the different perspectives and discourses that Stiegler uses to articulate the specificity of each of his distinct layers. So the objectivist ontology and empirical approach of neuroscience dictate that it can only encounter the brain as a thing and observe it either directly or via the screen displays of MRI scanners, the readings of EEGs, and so on. And indulge in these kind of correlations I was talking about. Neuroscience encounters a limit, I would argue, beyond which it cannot pass when it is a question of the immanently lived consciousness and experience of a world and of being, a dimension of which it can know nothing except, as I've said, by way of inferring correlations with reported noetic activities, experiences, or states. And of course, correlation is not causation, and inference may be problematic here. And by the same token, the phenomenological or psychosocial understanding of noetic activity encounters a similar limit when it seeks to think or present the lived immanent materiality of its own neurological base. This can be presented only as a thing in the world accessible to the observations of neuroscience. The brain cannot experience its own materiality as such, since this is the immanent condition and cause of its possibility of experience. So the limit of each of these perspectives, the gap or void that opens up, is one of the impossibility of determining or making present an abyssal, groundless, lived material immanence. This would be the lived immanence of consciousness for neuroscience and of a cerebral materiality for the noetic activity of consciousness. A lived immanence which in each case cannot be known or determined as such. And of course, neither neuroscience nor consciousness can present or encounter the meta-empirical field of technical traces and retentions, since it again is the immanent condition of both and not the simple empirical appearance of tools. So at one point in States of Shock, Stiegler suggests that philosophy consists perhaps always and firstly in thinking passages to the limit. His layering of the neurobiological, the plane of the psychosocial technical, and the psychic or noetic enacts just such a passage to the limit in respect to each. From the perspective of thought, these layers appear radically and even ontologically discontinuous or distinct. It is only at or within that point of lived material immanence, radically inaccessible to thought and presentation as such, that the mysterious continuity of the neurobiological, the psychotechnical, and the psychic or noetic can be situated. And I would like to use that actually on the basis of what Alexander said yesterday about exotic states of matter. For me, that would be a way in to actually explore the exoticism of matter. By way of conclusion, it might be said that what has happened in this experience of thought as the passage to a limit is that both philosophy and science are subjected to a specific limitation. Both encounter their limit as the frontier of all thought in relation to a radically unpresentable lived immanence. Philosophy as a passage to or experience of these limits is clearly no longer a metaphysical philosophy of foundations, grounds, or universal concepts. But similarly, science, whilst preserving the specificity and legitimacy of its methods and validity, encounters the limit of its objectivist approach, its inability to determine the dimension of immanently lived experience, which is unobjectifiable as such. This imposition of a limitation or a certain modesty upon science would nevertheless be a severe curtailment of the ambitions of scientism and its pretension to exhaust all knowledge of the human. Stiegler's technique of thought, as a thinking which carries thought to the limit of thought itself, does indeed imply a naturalist continuity between the biological, the technical, and the noetic. But as the experience of a limit, a frontier, or a void of thought within which that continuity must be located, this naturalism radically displaces the privilege of scientific epistemology in its power to exhaustively determine and totalize the immanent lived experience of the real, or the lived real of experience. In this way, the technicity of thought and the technique of thought at the limit is deployed in order to think that technicity, articulate a decisive shift and renewal of the relation of philosophy to science. Thank you.